In 1966, Richard Speck committed one of the most horrifying mass murders in American history when he brutalized and killed 8 student nurses living on Chicago's South Side. Richard Speck captured the nation's attention during the summer of 1966 after murdering 8 female students who lived together on Chicago's South Side. Before then, he had been responsible for other acts of violence against his family and others, but had a knack for escaping the police. After his killing spree in 1966, a manhunt ensued and he was captured 2 days later. He spent the rest of his life in prison until he died of a heart attack in 1991 at age 49. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, into a large, religious family, where he was the 7th of 8 children. Benjamin Speck died of a heart attack when his youngest son, Richard, was 6 years old. The boy took his father's death hard, regressing to eating crayons and attention-seeking behaviors. Pitying the grieving child, his sisters and female teachers babied him. Even into adulthood, Speck would often be financially dependent on his doting sisters, as he was perpetually drunk and frequently jobless. The remarriage of Speck's mother to Carl Lindbergh 3 years later, and the family's subsequent relocation to Dallas, Texas, gave the resentful boy an excuse to rebel against his strict religious upbringing. The family no longer struggled financially due to Lindbergh's lucrative career in insurance. However, Lindbergh was an alcoholic with a criminal record that included drunk driving and forgery, and he verbally demeaned Speck and his younger sister Carolyn. The children suffered considerable abuse at the hands of their drunken stepfather, and Speck's childhood was marked by juvenile delinquency and alcohol abuse. Speck dropped out of school at age 15. The youth let loose, drinking heavily, consuming pills, frequenting prostitutes, and continually getting arrested for such petty crimes as indecent exposure and forgery. Speck's mother stood by her son, loyally paying his bail and visiting him in jail each time he got in trouble. Mary Margaret Speck, Speck's psychiatrist, would later say that Mary Speck's unconditional love created an internal conflict within Speck. He could no longer be honest with himself about the resentment he felt toward his mother for demanding his rigid adherence to the dictates of the Christian faith, and for upending his world with the introduction of an abusive stepfather and relocation from the home he knew. Speck began to idolize his mother, holding Mary Speck up as a saint to whom no woman could compare. He unleashed the unresolved anger that lurked in his subconscious outward onto other women. He justified his hatred by deciding that too many women were sexually easy and deserved any foul treatment he might inflict. At age 20, Speck met 16-year-old Shirley Malone at a state fair. After 3 weeks of dating, the teen discovered she was pregnant, and the pair Wednesday 16-year-old Shirley Malone married Richard Speck after he impregnated her. Richard choked and hit Shirley if she refused to submit to sex acts 4 to 5 times a day. Speck viewed his teen bride as a sexually loose woman, and was plagued by the unsubstantiated fear that she was cheating on him. To punish Shirley Speck for these perceived slights, Richard Speck would routinely kiss and fondle women in a car in front of the house. When Speck saw his pregnant teen wife looking on, he would laugh, reveling in her pain before driving off. Speck demanded sex from his wife 4 to 5 times a day, and would slap and choke her if she refused. He missed the birth of his daughter, Bobby Lynn, as he was behind bars at the time, serving a brief stint on charges of theft and check fraud. When turned loose, Speck refused to pay the hospital expenses his wife had incurred during her pregnancy and labor. During this period he had the words "Born to Raise Hell" tattooed on his arm, a sentiment that wife Shirley had experienced firsthand. She filed for divorce in January 1966. After Speck was arrested for burglary and assault, he fled to Chicago to seek shelter with his sister, Martha, a couple of months later. He spent a few days there before traveling to Monmouth, Illinois, where he stayed with some family friends from his early childhood. Around this time, Speck sexually attacked a random woman at knife point and nearly killed her. When arrested, he claimed he had blacked out and couldn't remember the incident. He was permitted to plead down to aggravated assault and got off with a slap on the wrist. Law enforcement sources believed Speck broke into the home of 65-year-old Virgil Harris in Monmouth, Illinois on April 2, 1966, and raped, robbed and bound her. Speck is also the sole suspect in April 13, 1966 beating death of local barmaid Mary Kay Pierce. To evade further police questioning, Speck skipped town and found work on a ship. Everywhere the ship docked, women seemed to come up missing or brutally killed. Authorities in the state of Indiana wanted Speck for questioning in the disappearances of 3 young women on July 2, 1966. Authorities in the state of Michigan wanted to ask Speck about the murders of 4 girls and women between the ages of 7 and 6. Tax, however, paled into insignificance on July 13, 1966, when Speck arrived on the doorstep of a townhouse in South Chicago, which served as a communal home for a group of 8 young student nurses from nearby South Chicago Community Hospital. When 23-year-old Corazon Amurao opened the front door to Speck's knock, he forced his way in at gunpoint. Speck then rounded the nurses up and ordered them to empty their purses before tying them all up. He proceeded to brutalize them in the most horrific fashion over the following few hours. Those who had been fortunate enough to be out at the time of his arrival found themselves also subjected to brutal attacks when they returned home later that evening. A total of 8 women, between ages 19 and 24, were systematically bound, robbed, beaten, strangled and stabbed during Speck's frenzy. According to the New York Times, at least 1 victim was raped. The body count was so high that he failed to notice that Amurao, who had opened the door for him on his arrival, had managed to hide herself under one of the beds. When he left, hours later, taking the money he had stolen, she cowered in her hiding place, terrified, for hours, before finally summoning the courage to seek help. She climbed out on a window ledge and screamed for help, at which point concerned neighbors summoned the police. The arrest. The police arrived to scenes of carnage and took Amurao into custody, interviewing her and proceeding with the construction of an identikit image. Fortunately, Amurao remembered the distinctive Born to Raise Hell tattoo that, along with the image, enabled police to identify their suspect as Richard Speck. Subsequent nationwide inquiries also raised the other incidents in which Speck was suspected, as well as his criminal record. In the days before automated fingerprint identification, it took almost a week to identify the prints found in the townhouse as his. Media coverage splashed Speck's image all over the front pages, and in a desperate bid to escape, Speck tried to commit suicide on July 19, 1966, by slashing his wrists in the seedy hotel he was staying in. Changing his mind at the last minute, he summoned help and was taken to Cook County Hospital, where, again, his tattoo gave him away, and he was arrested and taken into custody. He was in need of surgery to repair his severed artery, and was watched over by a dozen policemen who were determined to ensure that his days of making lucky escapes were over. Speck's trial began on April 3, 1967, and his claim that he had no recollection of the 8 murders committed placed Corazon Amurao in the spotlight as the star witness. Despite concerns about her ability to testify after her harrowing ordeal, she gave a faultless performance, impressing the jury with every detail of that evening, identifying Speck unequivocally. The trial lasted just 12 days, and on April 15, 1967, the jury found Speck guilty of all 8 murders, after less than an hour's deliberation. The judge sentenced Speck to death. Speck's death sentence was commuted to 50 to 100 years in prison when the U.S. Supreme Court abolished capital punishment. Speck was never officially charged with the murders of which he was suspected prior to the events that took place in the South Chicago townhouse, and officially, those cases remain unsolved. In 1996, 5 years after Speck's death, a TV journalist made public a prison video which showed Speck taking drugs and engaging in sex with another inmate during the 1980s. While he was an inmate at Statesville Correctional Institute, Speck appears to have breasts in the video, apparently as a result of hormone treatment received while in prison, and is wearing women's underwear. In the video, Speck also casually admits to the killing of the nurses, describing the strangulations in some detail, and bragging behind bars. Speck died from a heart attack on December 5, 1991, a day before his 50th birthday.
Richard Speck. The disturbing video in which Speck discusses the murders and shows evidence of his bizarre life behind bars.
How'd you feel after killing those ladies? Like I always felt. Had no feeling. I felt sorry, but no.
More shocking than Speck's lack of remorse was his change in appearance. Apparently through the use of hormones, he had transformed his body to ensure his survival in one of America's most dangerous prisons.
He had the certain trappings of a female body that made him very desirable to